I think we might have a winner here.
Yeah, we got a winner indeed. So here's the interview. State Senator Jeffrey Brandis from the beautiful Sunshine State of Florida. Dave, would you kick it into high overdeer and make sure that we get that clip played?
Yeah, Jamie, let's roll that interview.
And welcome back to Consumer Choice Radio. We are here on the phone and we're connected with State Senator Jeffrey Brandis. He represents Pinellas County over there in Florida. And the reason we wanted to bring him on is that he had very interesting things to say about the governor's veto of the flavor ban there. I'm going to be reading from the tweet. Thank you, Governor Ron DeSantis, for the veto of Senate Bill 810. Florida law should not deny individuals seeking safer alternatives from the harms of tobacco. A society that values individual liberties has nothing to fear from the flavors mint or mango. State Senator Brandis, thanks so much for coming on Consumer Choice Radio.
Great to be with you. Thanks for having me.
So let's get to the context of this tweet. David and I had mentioned this in the previous show, and I think we've talked about it a lot, and we do a lot of research in the area of vaping and tobacco harm reduction. Tell us about this bill and why you think the veto of it was such a good idea.
So it's a bill that I fought against from the very beginning, fought against it last year as well when something similar popped up. But it's an area where I just completely disagree with my fellow legislators on this topic that we need to ban flavors. I could not imagine us getting a bill through the legislature that said we were going to ban alcohol flavors because kids were more likely to utilize flavored alcohol versus straight corn moonshine. That just didn't make any sense to me. And we know vaping is, for many people, a pathway away from traditional cigarettes. And so to me, it seemed irresponsible and was going to create public health outcomes that were totally unacceptable to force people to move to smoking. Not that we weren't going to ban vaping. We were only banning flavors of vaping. So we we're going to force them to only have traditional tobacco flavored vapes, which is something that many people just don't want to do.
Yeah, Yaël and I have had this conversation quite a bit, and in many points with legislators, is highlighting the reason why flavors matter. So youth access is a problem. There are solutions or ways in which that can be dealt with without banning flavors. But it just seems so silly to me that many, yourself not included, don't see the irony in only having tobacco flavored vape products. Because if you talk to anyone who has used vaping as a means of getting away from cigarettes, the last thing they want is something that tastes like cigarettes.
Right.
And whatever their flavor of choice is what allows for them to actually get away from cigarettes, which is, I think, something that pretty much everyone can universally celebrate.
Well, look, we know the British Journal of Medicine that says that vaping is 95% safer than smoking. And while it's not completely safe, and we would all agree that the best outcome is people kind of stop doing all of that, but for many people, and we understand this in the science of brain science here as well, is that when we're dealing with one addiction, the solution to that addiction is to transfer it to a less harmful substance. And so I think that's what vaping is. It's definitely a transition away from what we know is incredibly harmful. We know that people smoke for the nicotine, but they die from the tar. And vaping offers them the opportunity to have an alternative nicotine delivery device and not get the tar, which is what's killing them.
Definitely. We're speaking with State Senator Jeff Brandis. You can follow him on Twitter at Jeffrey Brandis. We'll link to that in all of our show notes and descriptions, and obviously put that in the links. Let's talk a little bit about your legislative career. Obviously, you're not up for re-election right now, as far as I know, but you are someone who is very new to public policy and to being a legislator. What is your sort of background, and what got you interested in the realm of public policy or governance?
Sure. So I joined the Army 7 days after high school. I spent 11 years in the military. I spent 2003, 2004 in Iraq with the 101st. I got back, thought I was going to come back and work for my family business, and they sold it. So I got into politics for the first time in 2010 in the Florida House, and then ran for the Florida Senate in 2012, and then have been reelected a number of times for the Florida Senate. I'm somebody who loves public policy and loves this idea that there's one big idea in every area of public policy. And I really want to work on that big idea. So whether that's in the world of transportation, where we see the world getting more shared electric and self-driving or automated, we really focus in on those three areas. And if it's in the area of criminal justice reform, which has become a passion of mine, it's really what are the outcomes that we really want? And what are the best practices from around the country that lead to those outcomes? And then how does somebody who leans libertarian as a Republican infuse libertarian thought into the conversation? And that often finds me aligning with different groups that traditionally wouldn't be seen as Republican groups overall. And so I'm somebody who supports adult use cannabis and has advocated for that and written a number of bills. I passed the smokable bill in Florida for medical cannabis a couple of years ago. And so we've been trying to work through and bring kind of a more libertarian, less government thought to this process and allow people to have individual liberty, individual freedom wherever we can.
And how do you find, so if you're collaborating, let's say, with people across the aisle who may agree with you on the ideas of adult use cannabis, why do you think there's such a gap? And I ask this question because more often than not, I find that we will have allies on the left, for lack of a better term, who are pro-legalization, when we think that's fantastic, but they're and they use harm reduction arguments, but they're very anti-tobacco harm reduction and anti-vaping. And so it's like they realize the benefits of getting rid of the prohibition mentality for cannabis, but yet they want to reenact prohibition for things like vaping flavors. Have you been able to kind of convince some folks across the aisle that really those are two sides of the two sides of the same coin?
I think ultimately it's a lack of education. They have never really been exposed to vaping. They've been exposed to marijuana in college or as a young adult. And so they have this exposure and they recognize that, hey, it wasn't as bad as, everybody told me it was going to be. But now they're going into vaping and they're like, look, I don't really have a context for this conversation and I've never really been educated on it. And frankly, it's arrived almost overnight in many cases to their state. It came kind of gradually, but now it's all here in any grocery store or frankly any convenience store you go to. Right behind the counter, there's a row of vape products, and that's not something we'd seen 3 or 4 years ago. So for legislators, it's really about getting educated. It's about understanding the safety aspects of it, and then understanding the brain science of addiction and why harm reduction is such a powerful tool in helping people manage addictions.
And speaking of someone who has a lot of education, it seems as if your legislative record here is very intense. Just in the last session, just the number of bills that you've introduced or co-introduced, I mean, it's just numerous. We'll link to that as well into the show notes. But what have been...
I'm a policy addict.
Yes, policy addict. What have been some of the more passionate areas of public policy in which you've either collaborated or perhaps introduced a bill? Because believe me, there's plenty of topics here that I think we can discuss.
Yeah. So look, I think, we're really fascinated about this idea that there's one big idea in every area of public policy. So we spend a lot of time trying to find that big idea. In fact, when I was first elected, I was kind of overwhelmed by a variety of different areas of public policy, and I really wanted to learn. And so I went to what I thought for young legislators was the single best source of new ideas and finding that big idea for public policy. And so I watched hundreds and hundreds of TED Talks as a way to just understand from a variety of different angles, how do I find that big idea? In the world of self-driving, I came across Sebastian Thrun from Google's conversation about self-driving cars and was captivated by that and thought that was an idea that was going to be transformative in the world of transportation. And so how do we position a state like Florida in a conversation on the future of mobility? So worked with Uber and Lyft to bring them to Florida, have now shifted to working on electric vehicles, because I think in transportation, that's the single largest shift you and I are going to see over the next decade, is this shift to EVs. And I think when people start to recognize the economics behind an electric vehicle and see the reduction in maintenance, the reduction in the ability to standardize your fuel costs, then all of a sudden it makes a ton of sense. And we're going to start to see massive shifts towards electric vehicles to the point where we could see 25 to 35% of all new vehicles sold by 2030 being electric, which will have a massive shift in the overall economy, whether that be with gas stations or dealers or and throughout the system. So in the world of transportation, I think that's the big shift. But in the world of but I think that there needs to be this conversation and this shift back towards personal freedom, individual liberty. And that's, if you look at most of my legislation, it tries to take that bent. And where I really got passionate about a number of years ago came from a case in South Florida where we had an individual who was incarcerated in South Florida act out while he was in his prison cell. And we had the guards throw him in the shower, turn the shower all the way up, and leave him there for a couple of hours. When they came back, he was dead. And besides his screams of pain and agony from being in this hot shower, nobody was ever charged with a crime for that. And I remember sitting in a committee hearing, hearing that conversation go on and looking around, and I saw a legislator on his phone. I saw a couple of people not paying attention to that conversation that was happening. And I had this kind of visceral reaction, like I was on a plane at 30,000 feet that had an engine out and nobody was at the controls of this thing. And so I, ran in and started working on criminal justice reform. And I found out that 85% of Florida's prisons are not air conditioned. And I found out that most of Florida's prisons had no education component of incarceration. In fact, we had largely shifted towards just warehousing people and began to work on working with national groups and state groups to say, all right, what's a better plan? How do we need to fix the education system in the prison system so we can focus on better outcomes? This is all about public safety. In fact, the Florida Criminal Punishment Code today says, no, the reason that we have the Criminal Punishment Code is to punish people. Well, if punishment is the only goal, then we're really missing out on what it should be about, which is how do we get better public safety outcomes? And so if you look at one of the pieces of legislation, it simply strikes the word punishment and puts in the word public safety, because that's what our public safety system should be about. And so when we focus on better outcomes, I think the key is, what's the research show? What's the data show? And how are we aligning the goals of the state of Florida on that best practice that we've gotten from other states? If we think of the states, they're really the laboratories of democracy, right? They can explore all kinds of different ideas. Great. There's nothing that says we can't take the best idea from the other states and implement them in the state of Florida. So why aren't we doing that? And why aren't we doing that in criminal justice reform? And so what I really have found is that most issues need two things. They need a vision and they need a champion. And so how do we constantly come up with, here's the vision that we have for whatever it is we're dealing with: transportation, insurance, education, healthcare, and then who's going to be the champion in the legislature that's going to run those best ideas? Whether that's, in medicine, we're going to focus on telemedicine and we're going to expand access to telemedicine and then create a series of advanced practitioners that aren't doctors, but that can deal with the massive healthcare needs that we have in the state and provide people at least entry-level access to a healthcare provider. Because for most people, they don't have that entry level into the system. The wealthy will always have it. But for those who are not wealthy, they don't even know where to begin the access to the system. And so they most commonly access it through the ER. Well, that isn't the most efficient way to handle that. And it overwhelms the ERs. And it's by far the most costly medicine cost that we have in medicine, is this funding this ER system that's handling basic healthcare needs. So how do we think about that in a different way? So it's trying to bring these different perspectives to bear and to say, look, we have to cast a vision for what we ultimately want, but let's talk about the outcomes that we want and figuring out what the best practices are to get there.
So, what you just described, I think, is Yaël and I's political viewpoints, probably in 3 minutes or less. So you're definitely on the right radio program and talking to the right individuals on that front. But I'm curious to know where your philosophical background comes from, because we all have different stories about why we view the political system the way we do. I mean, your story about that poor individual in prison in that shower is obviously a core component of that. But where does your viewpoint come from in terms of your perspective on individual liberty, on embracing innovation, and things like that?
Sure, I think it comes from two predominant areas. One, I grew up in a house of faith, and my faith truly I try to use that in guiding my overriding decisions. And so that would be the foundational level of where I come from. But I think beyond that, while I was in Iraq, I read Capitalism and Freedom by Milton Friedman. And to tell you that had an oversized influence on my political views, because I sat back and I said, wow, I'm probably a libertarian. I'm probably somebody who believes that, we should just have less government. We should let people live their lives, and practice this individual freedom. And so as I studied and researched and read more, and listened to more of what he had to say, I truly believe he was right. That frankly, government's tendency is just to take over everything, and that we have to have a group of people that push back against that. But that was frankly, the founding fathers were probably libertarians. They believed, for the most part, in individual freedom. They had seen this oppressive government that tried to get involved in more and more of their lives, and they built a constitution to protect us and provide individual liberties and freedoms. And it's up to us to defend those now, because the tendency of man is to continue to gain more and more power. But the way the Constitution was written was to keep the power at the citizen at the state level. It's up to us to defend those values.
I'm really happy that, we're obviously having you on around election time. Obviously, you're not up. David and I would probably cast illegal ballots in your favor. But one thing that we've noticed a lot in just studying different jurisdictions and what's happening in state to state is that, man, these local elections and state rules, they matter. And there's not really a focus. We always have our focus on the White House, always on the federal government. But there's so much that happens at the state level that actually does impact your life. And a lot of the reforms that you seem to be pushing is seeking a way to alleviate that. I was wondering if you could speak to kind of the difference between the local government perspective and then this, I don't know if it's infused through culture, maybe it's through our media, just this total focus that we have just on federal government and who happens to be in DC.
Well, look, you have to understand the media has a nationwide audience. And so they're going to be focusing on these national issues. But what I don't think most people appreciate is how much work and how much of the laws that they deal with on a day-to-day basis are from the state. And so I think that it's oftentimes what I find is most people don't know what I do. As much as I tell them, as much as I've been elected for now a decade, they don't know, because they're not focused on that, because the media doesn't talk about that on a day-to-day basis. They want to talk about Washington issues. The amount of people that think I'm a U.S. senator and not a state senator, and send me every time some national issue comes up, want to send me an email so I can fight this or do that. That's great. But I'm trying to lower your insurance costs in Florida. I'm trying to fix a criminal justice system. I'm trying to make sure that you're not stuck in a traffic jam every day. That's not something that your federal politicians are working on a day-to-day basis. So I think it's incumbent upon us to think about our state laws and to be advocating to our local legislators the key priorities that we have for our state. And it's something that we don't see a lot of. The amount of phone calls that I get that say, hey, I just want to talk policy for a little bit and try to understand your thinking or help me share a vision of what I have from our area, are probably, I can count on my hand in the amount of times that I've had that conversation with somebody in the last 10 years that just randomly called me and said, let's talk about public policy. Most people I have this problem I want to deal with, I have this specific issue with this agency that I need to deal with, and that's why they're calling us. But I think people need to, one, know their local elected officials' names, and two, meet with them and help share and cast and shape the vision they have for their community.
Yeah, I think that is such an important gap across the country, for that matter, where you have all of these questions of, okay, like everything from what the tax rate on your gas is going to be, to if you can get an Uber, to if you're vacationing in Florida and you have access to, let's say, Airbnb, or all sorts of other things that really impact your daily or weekly life. A lot of those decisions are made by folks like yourself and not Trump or Biden. And regardless of where someone stands, you see this all the time. It'll be like, oh, well, if Biden gets elected, he's going to ruin America. And it's like, well, the president really only goes so deep into into state policy. And then people on the flip side will say, well, if Trump gets reelected, the country's going to fall apart. And it's like, well, I think people maybe overestimate the power of the president in some of those personal issues, and they underestimate the importance of collaborating, working with folks like yourself. So it's a huge, huge gap there that Yaël and I work in terms of talking to consumers, is getting them engaged on some of these issues locally and highlighting that importance. So thank you for pointing that out to our listeners, because I'm sure there's going to be a few people who do listen to that and go, oh yeah, wait a second, it is my local town councilor or my local state legislator who's ultimately going to make the call on that.
Yeah, I think it's just important that people build a relationship with their local elected officials, and it's not a hostile relationship. Even if we disagree, we can be cordial about our disagreements. I often go on Facebook and post something controversial and say, let's discuss. And I'll spend an inordinate amount of time answering and questions and addressing those types of issues in the background, because I want people to be able to have a conversation, and I frankly want to be able to understand their perspectives and thinking on some of the difficult issues that we're facing.
We've been speaking with State Senator Brandis from Florida, from Pinellas County. Really some great topics that we've been able to cover. Can't do the full hour, but we'd love to have you back on. Mr. State Senator, I think you bring up some amazing ideas. Hopefully we can work with you in the future and see what we can do in Florida and beyond. And I think, David, we're going to brand him a consumer choice champion. No doubt.
Yes. Yeah, consumer choice champion and friend of the show.
There we go. So State Senator, thanks so much for coming on the program.
Thanks. It's been great to be with you. And I'll just leave you with kind of one challenge, and hopefully your listeners will do it, which is go reach out to your local state elected officials and have a conversation on policy. Pick a topic and meet with them, or call them on the phone, do a Zoom, whatever. But it's so important that you build that relationship over time with those individuals, and because they need your feedback, they need your guidance, and they need you to help cast that vision for the future. Thanks.